Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo. Specifically, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup in our fundamentals demo, and we're also going to explore a new topic, sort of an introduction to objects. Now, we're not going to go that deep into objects or classes in this particular video. This video is just sort of supposed to be an introduction so you can sort of peek behind the curtain or look to see what's in the future. This video assumes that you have already worked a little bit with the GetInfo and DisplayInfo functions that were handled in earlier videos. And what we're going to do now is we're going to make some slight modifications to the earlier functions and their function names so that we can now inject another example. And so to begin with, you want to verify that you've got your DisplayInfo working and your GetInfo working. And we're going to make a few minor changes here. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to change the switch for the original GetInfo because it focused on using strings. As a matter of fact, a significant number of strings. Now, we're still going to use strings, but this time around, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a better way of handling all of the data that is being collected from the user. If you recall from the previous videos, passing 11 arguments to the DisplayInfo function was kind of a little bit painful, and if anything, didn't really make a lot of sense. Part of the reason we did that was to highlight why you would probably want to rethink this approach. Now, again, I want to emphasize before we get too far into this, this is not going to be an exclusively object-oriented approach that we're going to be doing here. If anything, this is going to be very similar to what you saw in C or C++, and you would argue that essentially we're using our classes and objects as glorified structures, and that's okay. For this first example, I want to focus just simply on how we can get started using objects. And so if you recall with the original GetInfo, which is down here, the original GetInfo simply collected the information from the scanner and put it into separate variables. And then those separate variables were passed as arguments to the DisplayInfo function. Once again, not a terribly bad way of doing things. It's just that there were so many arguments that it was easy to lose track of what we were doing. What if we could just wrap all of these arguments up into one nice single object and then simply pass this object to our DisplayInfo function? Now, obviously, this is going to take a little bit of work on our part to get our GetInfo and our DisplayInfo to work appropriately, but let's start this process off by renaming our GetInfo. And we've got a couple places that we want to do this. And so we can either do this through a refactor and a rename. We're going to call our GetInfo, how about if we call it GetInfo with strings? And again, we will still be using strings in the future, but this just helps to delineate our examples here. And we're going to go ahead and apply the rename to the comments as well. And so now we have our GetInfo with strings. And then we also need to make sure and update our command line switches, which were not handled. So we have our GetInfo with strings. And then while we're at it, let's go ahead and make a minor change in the second GetInfo. If you think about it, we really weren't doing any sort of interactive input. We weren't really getting anything from the user. We were assuming that they were passed by the command line and then simply then displaying that in a nice table. So just to keep this clear, we could probably argue very effectively that this is nothing more than the DisplayInfo with arguments. And so I'm going to rearrange this ever so slightly. I'm going to push this up here so that we have this next to the other DisplayInfo, which is static, and the second one then uses the arguments from the command line. Now, what we want to do is we want to think in terms of another function where we simply collect all the information, we put it in an object, and then we display the contents of that object. And so this will be a multiple step process. The first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and create another function, and we're simply going to call this GetInfo with object. And so to start off with, what we want to do is we'll come down here to the bottom, and we'll again have another public static void function that we're going to call GetInfo with object. It's going to accept no input arguments, and it's going to return no input arguments. Now, from here, we've got a couple of options that we can do. We can rewrite all of our prompts one by one, or we can leverage a little bit of copying and pasting. But before we do this, we have to ask ourselves, where will we store this information? Well, the idea here is that we want to create a new class and then ultimately use an instance of that class to store all of this information in. You can think back to working with C and the idea of a structure, in that you could create a structure or the template for a structure in the type def, and then simply create instances of that structure, either an array of structures, or with the linked lists, you could use then addresses to the structures and so on. But in Java, we don't have the exact equivalent to a struct. Sure, there are some similar structures in Java, but they are not the same as the C struct. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a class to contain all of the information. Now, again, I emphasize this is not true object-oriented programming. As a matter of fact, if anything, it's sort of an abuse of objects, but it is a good way to bridge the gap between using C and now using Java. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we start off with a new class, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in our existing file. And I'm actually going to go ahead and make an intentional mistake here so we can see some limitations here. And I'm going to call this class collected info. And the idea is that it would simply hold the information associated with our collected info from the user. We have a curly braces and our closed curly braces. And right off the bat, we're going to get a warning that says class collected info is public, and she should be declared in a file named collectedinfo.java. In Java, you can only have one public class per file, or one primary class per file. And so we have a couple of options here. Number one is we can simply go ahead and delete the public scope qualifier from the front. And at this point, we're fine. We're going to do it this way to begin with, and I'm going to show you then ultimately how to move it over to another file. Now, again, we're going to sort of take some shortcuts here because this is our first example of dealing with classes and objects. But what I want to do is I want to build now the container, if you would, of this collected info that's going to hold all of the information. The data types, we're still going to keep simple. We're just going to use strings. And so we'll start off with a java.lang.string. And we're going to specify that it is going to be public. So it's a public java.lang.string. And we're going to call this one first name. We're going to continue this with another public java.lang.string last name. And so on with each one of the strings that we had previously used being now part of this collected info class. So we have another java.lang.string for the Blazor ID, one for the initials, one for the languages, the goals for the class, the goals professional, graduation, computer model, and computer memory. And then lastly, our computer CPU. So actually, it turns out that I see that we actually have a slight mistake in our earlier calling of our function, which we're going to go ahead and correct. So computer memory, we seem to have accidentally passed this twice. There we go. So for our computer CPU and then computer memory. Now at this point, we have a class called collected info that has fields associated with it for each one of the pieces of information that we wish to collect from the user. Now, once again, before I go any further, I want to emphasize that this is not a good pattern that we're doing. This is just for demonstration purposes to begin with. You'll see why in just a little bit. Future videos, we'll talk a little bit more about the scope, but this is just to get us used to the idea of classes. Now, what we want to do is we want to go back up to our function GetInfo with object. And so what we want to do is we want to declare a new variable of type collected info. And so I'm actually going to emphasize this by saying EE333 dot collected info, and I'm going to specify that it is going to be sample collected info. The idea is that I want you to understand that this is one instance of the collected info. It does not represent all instances, but it is one instance or an object of class collected info. And you can continue this by using a new constructor, and we can specify EE333 dot collected info, and we simply provide it with a pair of parentheses to indicate that it passes no parameters to the constructor. Now, we'll talk more about constructors, but you'll notice that I didn't actually specify anything here. We can go back and deal with this. We've got a couple of options, but fundamentally all of our fields are currently not initialized. And so it's much like what you would have seen in C. Basically, we've declared all of these fields, we've allocated the memory to them, but we have not initialized them. And this could be a problem because effectively at this point, first name, last name, and so on don't actually have values associated with them. You've got a couple of ways that you can go about doing this. The first way, and arguably the lazy way to do it, is that you can simply specify a default value when you are declaring the variable, or in this case, the field. That is not ideal, although it is perfectly fine to do that in certain scenarios. Instead, what we want to do is we want to create a constructor called public collected info, and this becomes the constructor for our collected info class. Now you notice I have a little bit of a typo here, which is causing an error. You want to make sure that your constructor matches the name of your class. And so in this case, our public collected info is referred to then as a constructor for our class collected info. What this does is this creates an instance of our collected info class, and specifically with no input arguments. What this allows for us to do is to set the default values inside of our constructor. So set the default values. And once again, we will use this approach over and over. You'll have plenty of time to understand the benefits of doing it this way and some of the nuances. But let's just simply go through each one of our fields. And we start off by specifying first name equal to double quotes, and that simply initializes then the value for the first name field. What you can also do is prefix this with a this, which indicates that it is this first name. So this refers to this object, or better yet, this instance of the class, also known as an object. And we're going to continue this pattern here. So it's going to be this dot last name is equal to the double quotes, this dot blazer ID equal to double quotes, this dot initials equal to double quotes. It doesn't really matter the order that you do this in, as long as you manage to capture all of the default values so that you properly initialize this object. And so we'll go through here. We had the languages, this dot goals, class. And just for a little bit of variety, I'm going to go ahead and put as the default goal for this object to be to get an A, because I'm going to assume that is everyone's assumed goal for a course. And so you can see here that we don't necessarily have to initialize it simply to an empty string. So we have this dot graduation. We could specify, for instance, a default graduation. This dot goals professional. I believe that I have accidentally gotten these out of order. Let me take just a second to change this. And then now we focus on the fields associated with our computer model. CPU, and memory. And again, we're keeping this simple by using strings, just so that we're only dealing with one data type. You would do the same if you were doing integers, doubles, and so on, is that you would want to specify a default value or an initial value for each one of your fields. And again, we'll see how there are some better ways to go about doing this, alternate ways, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. However, now we have a class and a way of generating an instance of that class, so that now when we go back to our GetInfo with object, you have the ability to create a new object called sample collected info, and it is of type collected info. Now, let's go about actually populating it with our useful information. In other words, with the information that we've collected from the user. Now, you can very carefully do this by simply borrowing some of the lines that we have from above. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to do a couple of them, and then quickly you're going to see the pattern. And so what we can do now is we can prompt the user for their first name. And then instead of storing it in a separate variable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to store it in the first name field for the sample collected info. And so what we'll do here is that our sample collected info is just simply going to be equal to our scanner dot next line. And I realized that I forgot to bring that down. Let's go ahead and grab that real quick. So we need to create the scanner object. All right, so now we have our scanner object, and we're pulling from the scanner object just like we did in our earlier version of our GetInfo. We can repeat this then for each one of our fields. We'll have the last name. And then basically the difference is, much like when we were dealing with structures, is that you would prefix then the object name or the variable name associated with the object to the specific field that you were looking at. So in other words, in previous iteration of our GetInfo function, we would just be doing first name and last name. Now we are specifying the object and using the dot notation to indicate the particular field that we wish to modify. And again, this is not perfect object-oriented approach. This just gives us an introduction to using objects rather quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat just a little bit here. I'm going to copy and paste from the earlier GetInfo function. And you'll notice, of course, that NetBeans is complaining about the fact that we have none of these variables declared locally. And instead, what I'm going to do is very carefully just splice in the name of our object and the period in front of each one of these. And if we've named our variables and our fields the same, we should now be done. And so just to check to make sure that we don't have any errors, go ahead and build it. Now, just like before, we have our GetInfo with object, but we haven't actually done anything with it. As a matter of fact, you could run this much like we did in the earlier video and spend the time putting in the information and then be a little bit disappointed because you're actually not displaying anything yet. Well, our current display info functions don't really have the capacity to deal with an object. As a matter of fact, if you recall from an earlier video, our display info accepts a lot of individual arguments. And if anything, that's why we're here. We're wanting to come up with a better way to do this. Well, what you can do is you can create a third overload. We have the initial display info. We have the one that accepts all of the arguments. We can create a third one, public static void, and then display info, with the difference being this particular display info will accept an object of type EE333.collectedInfo. And what we'll do is, just to keep consistent with our variable naming scheme, we're going to call this one sample collected info. Now, it does not have to be the same because, once again, that's a local variable to a function, but just differentiate while we're first working through this. If I were to do this myself, we would drop the sample collected info and just call this collected info. But now what we want to do is we want to leverage what was our system.out.println from our earlier function. And if you copy and paste this down, you'll once again get a bunch of errors because it is not known by their individual variables. In other words, the data is not known by its individual variables. Instead, it is known through the use of this sample collected info. And again, what we can do is very carefully slice this in, including the period. And now what this does is this allows for us to pass an entire object as a single variable and pick apart the pieces, in this case, to print out each one of the fields using a single variable and the individual fields. And so our input argument count for our display info function drops drastically. Basically, we go from 11 arguments down to 1. Now, we can see this run in just a second, but before we get away from this, I want to point out one thing. At this point, all we need to do to make an addition or subtraction from our collected info would be to modify then our class down here. In other words, we could add additional fields. And as long as we remembered to do the same in our display info, we would not change our function signature. So hopefully, pretty quickly, you can see that there are a lot of advantages to using objects, even if we are not doing true object-oriented design. This is effectively how we would leverage structures as well in C. At this point, we just have to come up with a way to successfully run this. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to trigger another switch combination. Instead of calling it GetInfo with strings, I'm going to call it GetInfo with objects. And we're going to leave the argument count, or rather the argument length, to 1. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to come in here with another else if and duplicate the earlier one by saying args.length equal to 1. And our args square brackets 0 dot equals, ignore case. And in this case, it's going to be GetInfo with object for our demonstration purposes. And if that's equal to true, then what we want to do is we want to call our GetInfo with object. And that will be called by saying EE333 dot FundamentalsDemo dot GetInfo with object. And again, we're not passing anything to this particular function. So at this point, let's go ahead and build it. And again, we can right-click on the tree, or we can just simply select the build hammer. And real quick, we seem to have a successful build, but I'm being a little bit bothered here by our warning. I don't immediately see what the problem is. Sometimes you'll get this with NetBeans, is that there'll be a delay in the update. You may have to refresh the tree. Hopefully there's no problems here. I don't immediately see where they are, but if there are, we'll come back and take a look at it. Now, we'll do a couple of other things real quick. We want to change what our GetInfo does. So our display info calls display info function. And actually, we had another overload of this where we would display, and we would need to provide it then args square bracket 1 all the way up to args square bracket 11. There's probably going to be better ways of doing this, but I'll leave that for you to decide how you want to document this. Instead, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add a couple more lines in here in our help, some system.out.println. And as I said before, we have our get info with strings. And this just simply calls get info with strings function. And we'll copy and paste this and just change this to objects, or rather singular object. At this point, we should be back to a pretty well-aligned executable, as well as a help function that should actually tell us how this works. The last thing that we want to do now is we have our get info with object, and we have our display info that accepts an object, but it isn't being called by our get info with objects. So at the bottom of our get info with object, we want to call the appropriate overload. That accepts an object of type EE333 dot collected info. And to do that, we simply specify EE333 dot FundamentalsDemo dot display info, and we pass to it the sample collected info. And at this point, we should be set to go. As a matter of fact, whatever I did, I eliminated the warning. I suspect that it was probably warning me that we weren't actually currently using that. Either way, we have no warnings left on our packages, and we build successfully. Again, what you want to do is come over to your command window. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. We'll work through a couple of examples here. We're going to have our display info that is parameterless, and it just takes the default that we've hard-coded. We could also pass the version that required an additional 11 arguments. That would take us a little bit of time to get through, but why don't we go ahead and test our get info with object, just to make sure that we've got this one working. And it should start off by prompting us for our first name, our last name, our Blazor ID, our initials, the languages. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and borrow our text file to go ahead and include these, so that way we don't have to type all these out. I'm just going to very carefully copy and paste some of these. Our goals for the class. Our goals professionally. Our graduation. Our computer model. Computer CPU. And the computer memory. And hopefully we don't have any bugs in our code, at least none that will present themselves at runtime versus compile time. We should get a nice printout. And again, we should probably consider having an extra print line immediately after collecting the information so that we can separate the collection portion with the display portion. Right now, they're sort of smashed up next to each other. And we can do that just simply by inserting an additional system.out.println. Now, a couple of things to note here before we depart from this particular example is that, as I mentioned earlier, we chose to have the class collected info reside in the same file as our fundamentals demo.java. we do not, in fact, have to do that. And as a matter of fact, what we want to do before we leave this particular example is we want to go ahead and right-click on the source package. We're going to create a new Java class, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in my EE333 package, and I'm going to call it collected info. And I'm going to select finish. And we now have an additional file in our project. Excuse me, specifically, it is going to be under our EE333 package. Now, right now we're getting a warning, which is to be expected. And it says that basically it's caused a problem because we have collected info now in two different locations. What we want to do is go ahead and clean this file up a little bit. And you'll note that by default, it inserts a public class collected info. And what we're going to do is very carefully come in here, and we're going to remove the code associated with our first collected info and paste it into the public class and remove the additional remnants of it. And now what happens is we have a separate file with a separate public class. And by and large, this is going to be the approach that we're going to take. And so what we want to do now is we want to make sure that we have it in the same namespace, or excuse me, the same package. You'll note that both of these specify our EE333, and so no changes need to be made in the code. It just makes for a cleaner structure in our project. At this point, we can go ahead and build it, and we won't waste our time demoing it again, but functionally, it's going to be exactly the same as the earlier demo. So hopefully you found this video useful. This is meant as a brief introduction to objects. We're going to take one more look at this object before we, or excuse me, with this class. We're going to take one more look at this class before we completely leave it, and then we may revisit it in later videos. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.